Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark walked out of the bistro, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just agreed to. Marrying a woman he barely knew, for the sake of money and security, felt like something out of a dream or perhaps a nightmare. But there was no turning back now. He had made the choice, and now he had to live with it. But as the days went by, he would learn that this decision, this business arrangement, was about to turn into something much more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mark arrived at the grand mansion the next day, the gates creaking open as his cab rolled up the long, winding driveway. The house loomed ahead, a massive structure that looked more like a museum than a home. Its towering columns and pristine stone facade exuded old money, but the windows seemed dark and lifeless, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. He stepped out of the cab, suitcase in hand, feeling like a visitor in someone else's dream or perhaps a nightmare. Eleanor was already standing inside the grand foyer, her cool demeanor never wavering. She greeted him with a polite smile and the formal tone of someone who expected nothing less. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. Mark nodded mutely, following the housekeeper who led him upstairs. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't quite explain why. He wasn't sure if it was excitement or dread, but the walls seemed to close in as he walked through the luxurious halls, his footsteps echoing through the silence. The room they led him to was equally imposing. It was beautiful, with antique furnishings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. But despite its luxury, the room felt cold, as if untouched by human warmth. There was no personal touch, no sign of life, just the cold precision of wealth. Mark set his suitcase down on the king-sized bed, his mind racing with the reality of what had just happened. He had agreed to marry Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, for reasons that seemed more about survival than anything else. He tried to shake the unease that was creeping up his spine. His life had just changed forever, and he wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. But he couldn't turn back now. As he sat down on the edge of the bed, his thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A housekeeper entered, carrying a tray of food. "Dinner will be served shortly, Mr. Davis," she said before leaving without another word. Mark sat in silence, staring at the empty room. He couldn't help but feel like he was playing a part in someone else's story. A story that had been written for him, with no say in how it would end. But what else could he do? He had made a choice, and now it was time to live with it. At 7 sharp, Eleanor appeared at his door, looking every bit the part of a woman who had everything under control. She didn't ask if he was ready, she simply led him downstairs to the dining room. The table was set elegantly, with candles flickering softly in the dim light. It was all so perfect, so well arranged. Yet the tension between them was palpable, thick in the air. Mark felt like an intruder, like someone who had wandered into a life that wasn't his. They ate in silence for the most part, the clinking of their silverware the only sound filling the room. Every now and then, Eleanor would look up from her meal, her sharp eyes studying him, as if measuring him, assessing the man she had just made a contract with. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I hope you understand that this arrangement is not about affection, Mark. It is a business deal. There is no room for emotions." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing it from her lips made it all the more real. He didn't know why he had expected anything different. After all, she had made it clear from the beginning that this was purely business. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence. Mark couldn't stop thinking about his mother's medical bills and his sister's tuition. His family's future rested on this deal, and as much as he hated it, he had no choice but to go along with it. After dinner, Eleanor led him back upstairs. You'll find your room prepared. Sleep well, Mr. Davis. Tomorrow, we begin the next step. She didn't wait for a response, turning and walking away with the same controlled grace she had shown since they met. Mark stood there, staring after her, feeling more alone than ever. He had agreed to marry her for a chance at a better life, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had made the right choice. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his chest, and as he lay down on the cold, unfamiliar bed, he realized just how much his life had changed in the past 24 hours. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Mark awoke in the cold, unfamiliar room. The sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the antique furnishings. He stretched, feeling the weight of the day ahead pressing down on him. Eleanor had made it clear the night before this was a business arrangement, and there would be no room for mistakes. He had agreed to marry her, not for love, but for survival. But as the morning sun warmed the room, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just become something he could no longer control. He got up, dressed quickly, and went downstairs, where Eleanor was already waiting. She was sitting at a large wooden table, sipping coffee, her expression unreadable as usual. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," she said, her tone as calm as ever. "I trust you slept well?" Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure how to answer. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of his family and the choices he had made. "Yes, thank you," he said, sitting down at the table. The staff soon brought breakfast, a simple but elegant spread of pastries, fruit, and freshly brewed coffee. As they ate in silence, Mark noticed the subtle way Eleanor observed him, always watching, always calculating. He couldn't help but wonder what she saw in him. "So," Eleanor said after a long pause, "today we begin. I expect you to attend several meetings with me. There is much to do if we are to maintain the appearance of a successful partnership. Remember, this is about appearances, Mark. People must believe we are united." Mark swallowed hard. He had been expecting this. He knew that this marriage, this arrangement, would require more than just living under the same roof. It was about convincing the world that they were a couple, a perfect match, when in reality, they barely knew each other. "I understand," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They spent the rest of the morning going over plans for the upcoming events. Eleanor had a way of making everything seem effortless, as if she had everything under control. Mark followed her lead, doing his best to keep up. He had to admit, there was something impressive about her poise, her command over every situation. As the day wore on, they attended a series of high-profile meetings, and Mark did his best to play the part of the successful, confident husband. He was surprised by how quickly he adapted, slipping into the role of a man with everything to lose. But as the evening approached, something unexpected happened. At one of the social events, Eleanor seemed distant. She wasn't as engaged with the guests as she had been earlier. Mark, sensing something was wrong, found himself drifting closer to her. "Eleanor, are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, yet concerned. She looked at him for a moment, her face betraying no emotion. Then, without saying a word, she took a step back, as if creating a distance between them. "I am fine," she replied coolly. "But remember, Mark, this is not personal. This arrangement was never about emotions." Mark felt a pang in his chest, a strange mixture of frustration and sympathy. He had been so focused on the practical aspects of their agreement that he had almost forgotten that Eleanor, too, was affected by this. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a woman who had agreed to this arrangement for her own reasons, reasons that were still unclear to him. As the evening wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The distance between them was no longer just physical, it was emotional, too. He had come into this marriage with the understanding that it was about survival, but now, he was beginning to wonder if there was more to it than that. Was it possible that Eleanor, despite her cold exterior, was just as trapped in this arrangement as he was? And if so, was there any hope for them to find something real in the midst of their carefully constructed lies? The night ended with the usual formalities, but as Mark lay in bed that night, his mind was filled with questions. Eleanor had said this wasn't about love, but what if it was? What if, deep down, there was something between them that neither of them was willing to admit? For the first time since he had agreed to this marriage, Mark felt a flicker of hope, though he wasn't sure whether it was real or just wishful thinking. The next few days passed in a blur for Mark. He followed Eleanor from one event to another, always playing the part of the perfect husband. He accompanied her to charity galas, business meetings, and even social gatherings, each more formal and more high-profile than the last. As they mingled with guests, Mark began to realize just how effortless Eleanor made it look. She was always poised, always in control, her smile never wavering. But underneath it all, Mark couldn't help but notice the distance between them growing. She never let her guard down, not even once. She remained the same woman he had met that first night, cold, calculating, and detached. But still, something about her haunted him. He saw glimpses of vulnerability in her eyes, moments where her carefully crafted facade almost cracked. It was fleeting, but it was there, and it made him wonder if she, too, was struggling with the weight of their arrangement. One evening, after a particularly lavish gala, Mark found himself alone in the study. The rest of the house had fallen into silence, the hum of the party still lingering in the background. He sat in a plush armchair, staring into the empty fireplace, when he heard the soft click of the door opening. Eleanor stepped inside, her face tired but composed. "Mark," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I didn't expect to see you here." Mark stood up, feeling a strange pull in his chest. "I needed some space," he replied honestly. "It's been a long few days." Eleanor didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard her say anything like that before. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor sighed, walking over to the window and looking out at the darkened landscape. This arrangement, it's not just about appearances anymore, is it?" she asked, her tone heavy with something Mark couldn't quite place. "We've been pretending for so long, I'm not sure what's real anymore." Mark stood still, his mind racing. Had he imagined it, or was Eleanor starting to crack? The woman who had always been so composed, so in control, was now standing in front of him, vulnerable. "Eleanor, we're both in this together," he said quietly. "I know this wasn't what either of us expected, but we're in it now. We can't just walk away." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes I wonder if we're just going through the motions. If we're just two people living in a house, playing a part, but never truly connecting." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always known that this was a business arrangement, but hearing Eleanor say it out loud, hearing her voice crack with emotion, made him question everything. "What do you want, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. For the first time since they had met, Eleanor hesitated. She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to let her guard down completely. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I want something real. But I'm not sure I can find it in us." The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Mark didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he could give her what she wanted, but the thought of losing her, even in this strange, forced arrangement, hurt more than he cared to admit. "Maybe we can figure it out," he said, his voice gentle. "Maybe we can find something real in all of this." Eleanor didn't reply. Instead, she took a step closer to him, her gaze softening, though her expression remained guarded. "I don't know what's going to happen between us, Mark," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But I think we both deserve more than this." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Mark felt a spark of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find something real in this complicated arrangement. As the night grew colder and the house grew quieter, the two of them stood there, together, each lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, they were both willing to face it together, without the walls they had built around themselves. The next few days were a whirlwind for Mark and Eleanor. They continued to attend events, their every move scrutinized by the public, but something had shifted between them. The carefully constructed walls they had built around themselves were starting to crack, and despite their best efforts to keep things professional, there were small moments where they began to feel something real. Mark caught himself looking at Eleanor more often, noticing the way her eyes softened when she was lost in thought, or how her laughter, though rare, lit up the room. He hadn't expected to feel this way. But the more time they spent together, the more he realized how much he admired her strength, her ability to take control in any situation. Yet, despite all the changes, Eleanor remained distant. She was still the woman who had proposed this arrangement in the first place, cold, composed, and always in control. Mark couldn't help but wonder if she was still fighting her own feelings, just as he was. One evening, after another long day of meetings and public appearances, they returned to the mansion. The house was eerily quiet, and Mark found himself standing in the hallway, staring at the grand staircase that led to their separate rooms. For a moment, he stood there, wondering what Eleanor was doing, if she was as restless as he was. As if on cue, he heard the soft click of her heels approaching. She appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but there was something different in her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Mark," she said, her voice softer than usual, "can we talk?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. He nodded, his stomach tightening with anticipation. Of course. They walked into the study, the place where they had shared their most honest conversations, even though there had been so few of them. Eleanor closed the door behind them and took a seat at the large desk, her fingers gently tapping on the surface. She was silent for a moment, and Mark could feel the tension in the air. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady, but Mark could sense the vulnerability beneath it, "about what we've been doing. This arrangement. I can't keep pretending that it doesn't affect me." Mark stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't expect to feel this way. When we first made this deal, I thought it was just business. But now, every time I look at you, I feel something real." Mark's heart raced as the words hung in the air between them. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? "Eleanor," he said softly, "I didn't expect this either." But I think he paused, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I think there's something here too. Something more than just a business deal." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but her eyes were still clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do with this," she whispered. "I don't know if I can let myself feel this way, Mark. I built these walls for a reason. I can't just tear them down overnight." Mark took a step forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I know it's not easy, Eleanor. But maybe we don't have to tear everything down all at once. Maybe we can take it one step at a time." For the first time, Eleanor seemed to consider his words. She closed her eyes briefly, as if weighing the truth of what he was saying. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Maybe you're right," she murmured. "Maybe we can take it one step at a time." The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, but there was something different now. Something that wasn't there before. They weren't just two people trapped in a contract anymore. They were beginning to find their way towards something more. As they stood there, Mark felt a glimmer of hope in his chest. Perhaps this strange, complicated arrangement could lead them to something real, something worth fighting for. As the night wore on, the two of them found themselves sitting side by side in the study, talking more freely than they ever had before. It wasn't a perfect solution, and they both knew there were still many hurdles ahead, but for the first time, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to build something together. The following week, Mark and Eleanor's arrangement continued to evolve in ways neither of them had expected. They had started to let their guard down around each other, each day revealing more about their thoughts and feelings. While their connection was still new and fragile, it was undeniable that something was shifting. Eleanor no longer seemed entirely closed off, and Mark had begun to see glimpses of the woman beneath the polished exterior. One evening, after a long day spent at various business events and charity functions, they found themselves alone again in the mansion. Eleanor had seemed more distracted than usual, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare sense of unease. Mark couldn't help but notice, but he chose not to push her. She had been through so much, and he knew better than to expect her to open up on demand. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself, retreating to the study. Mark stayed behind, sitting in the large, quiet living room. The house, usually filled with the sound of their busy lives, felt eerily silent tonight. After a few moments, Mark stood up, feeling the familiar pull to check on her. He walked toward the study, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice gentle. There was a slight pause before she responded. "Come in." Mark opened the door and stepped inside. Eleanor was sitting by the window, looking out at the night sky, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. She looked tired, more vulnerable than he had seen her before. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Eleanor turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression softening. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I've been thinking about everything. About us." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He walked over to her and took a seat beside her, trying to gauge her mood. "What about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Mark. For feelings. I told you from the beginning that this was about business, but now I'm not so sure. There's a part of me that wants more, but I'm afraid of what it means. I've spent so long building walls around myself that I don't know how to tear them down." Mark reached over, gently taking her hand in his. It felt like a small gesture, but it spoke volume. He didn't say anything at first, he simply squeezed her hand, offering her the comfort of his presence. "You don't have to figure everything out right now, Eleanor," he said softly. "We're in this together, and I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. It was clear that she was fighting something inside, but there was also a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Slowly, she nodded. "I don't know what's going to happen," she whispered. "But I think I want to try. I don't want to keep pretending anymore. Maybe we can take this one step at a time, like you said." Mark's heart warmed at her words. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. He smiled gently, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it softly. "We'll take it slow," he agreed. "And whatever happens, we'll face it together." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. For the first time, there was no pressure, no need to have all the answers. There was only the promise of something real, something worth exploring. As the evening drew to a close, Mark and Eleanor found themselves standing together by the window, looking out at the stars. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, both of them allowed themselves to believe that it might just be something worth holding on to. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to grow, albeit slowly. They had agreed to take things one step at a time, and that was exactly what they did. Their interactions were still carefully measured, but there was a new sense of understanding between them. Eleanor seemed more relaxed, though still guarded, and Mark found himself looking forward to their moments together, however brief. But despite their progress, there was a nagging feeling in Mark's chest. The more time they spent together, the more he realized how deeply he had begun to care for Eleanor. It was not just the business arrangement Anna-Marie, it was something more. But there was still a wall between them, one that he could not seem to break down, no matter how hard he tried. Eleanor, though she had allowed herself to be more vulnerable, still held back. Mark could see it in the way she would avoid eye contact when things got too personal, the way she kept her emotions tightly locked away. He knew she was afraid of what it would mean if she let her guard down, afraid of getting hurt. But he was beginning to wonder if the fear was stronger than her desire for something real. One evening, after another long day of meetings and social events, they sat in the living room of the mansion, the soft glow of the fireplace casting shadows across the room. Mark glanced over at Eleanor, who was sitting by the window, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked distant, lost in thought. Mark couldn't take it anymore. He needed to know where they stood, needed to understand if there was more between them or if he was just fooling himself. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "we need to talk." She turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. "What's going on with us?" Mark asked, his voice soft but firm. "I feel like we've been dancing around this, pretending everything is fine, but I can't keep pretending. I need to know if there's something real here, or if we're just playing this part because it's easier." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She simply stared at him, her face a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and tinged with emotion. "I don't know, Mark. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can let go of the walls I've built. This whole thing, it's not what I planned. I never wanted to need anyone. I never wanted to need you." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had known that Eleanor was struggling, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing her admit her fear, made it all the more real. He stood up and walked over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt in front of her, looking into her eyes. "Eleanor, you don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "I'm here. I want to be here. We don't have to have everything figured out right now, but we can figure it out together." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "I don't know if I can let myself love you, Mark," she whispered. "But I want to try. I want to take that risk." Mark smiled softly, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were both on the same page. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "We don't have to rush, Eleanor. We just have to be honest with each other." She nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "One step at a time," she repeated. And for the first time, Mark believed it. They didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to know what the future held. They just needed to take the first step, and they were doing that together. The night ended quietly, but there was a sense of calm between them now, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. As they sat together by the fire, Mark realized that even though the path ahead was uncertain, for the first time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. As the weeks went by, Mark and Eleanor settled into a new rhythm, their lives blending in ways neither of them had anticipated. Their arrangement, once driven solely by necessity, had evolved into something more, something real. Though they still maintained a careful distance, there were moments of connection, small gestures of kindness and understanding that marked a shift in their relationship. Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, seemed less guarded, her walls slowly coming down, piece by piece. She was still the woman who had built her empire with precision and control, but now, Mark saw glimpses of the woman who had once dreamed of something more. He had come to admire her strength, her intellect, and her quiet vulnerability. But despite their growing closeness, the past still loomed over them. Eleanor had spent years building walls around her heart, and Mark knew it wouldn't be easy for her to completely let go of her fear. One afternoon, after another long day of meetings, they found themselves sitting on the balcony of the mansion, the golden light of sunset casting a warm glow over the city below. Eleanor was unusually quiet, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. Mark watched her, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. He knew they were at a crossroads, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what direction they would take. "Eleanor," he said gently, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" She turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. She hesitated, then let out a deep sigh. "I don't know, Mark," she admitted, her voice soft. "I keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing. Us. I never wanted to need anyone, and now I'm not sure how to handle this. I'm afraid. Mark reached out, taking her hand in his heart aching for her. He had always known she was afraid, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing her admit her vulnerability, made everything feel even more real. You don't have to be afraid, Eleanor, he said, his voice firm but gentle. We're in this together. You don't have to have all the answers right now. I don't either. But we'll figure it out. Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace between them, a quiet understanding that transcended their past fears and insecurities. I want to believe you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I want to trust that this is real. Mark smiled, his thumb gently brushing over her hand. It is real, he said. And I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, they sat there in silence, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees below the only noise. It was as if the world had slowed down, allowing them to simply be in the moment. Mark could feel the tension easing between them, the weight of the past slowly lifting. They didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to know what the future held. What mattered was that they were facing it together. After a while, Eleanor spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Maybe I can learn to trust again, she said, her words tinged with uncertainty but also with hope. Mark squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. You don't have to do it alone, he said softly. I'll be right here, every step of the way. As the sun set on the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden light, Mark and Eleanor sat together, no longer just two people bound by a contract, but two people beginning to build something real. They didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, they were ready to face it, hand in hand. Days turned into weeks, and Mark and Eleanor's connection deepened in ways neither of them had expected. The walls they had built around themselves were now nothing more than faint memories. They had started to understand each other in a way that went beyond the surface, and with each passing day, their bond grew stronger. They had moved past the business arrangement, into something that felt like a partnership, a real relationship. Eleanor still held some reservations, but the changes in her were undeniable. She was opening up, not just to Mark, but to the idea of vulnerability and trust. And Mark, for his part, had realized that the love he felt for her had grown in the most unexpected ways. He had come into this arrangement thinking it was a lifeline, a way out of his troubles, but now, he saw it for what it was, a chance at something much deeper than he could have imagined. One evening, after another round of high-profile meetings, they sat together on the balcony once again, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The sky was painted in hues of purple and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Eleanor, usually so composed, was more relaxed now, her eyes soft as she looked out at the view. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. Eleanor, he said softly, his voice low and steady, we've come a long way, haven't we? She turned to face him, a small smile playing on her lips. Yes, we have, she replied, her voice soft. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one that needed no words. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment. The moment to say what he had been holding back for so long. I never imagined I'd be here, he continued, his heart pounding in his chest. But now I realize, I don't just want this to be a partnership. I want more than that, Eleanor. I want to be with you. Not because of some contract, not because of anything else, but because of you. Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She looked at him, her gaze searching, as if she were trying to read his soul. Mark held his breath, unsure of what she would say. But then, slowly, Eleanor stepped closer, her hand gently resting on his. Mark, she whispered, I've been afraid for so long. Afraid of needing someone, afraid of being vulnerable. But with you, I feel like I can finally let go. Her words hit him like a wave. He had known she was afraid, but hearing her admit it so openly, so honestly, made him realize just how much trust they had built between them. I want this too, Eleanor, he said, his voice steady with emotion. I want us. I want everything with you. Eleanor smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek, but it wasn't one of sadness, it was one of release. "I think we've found something real," she whispered. And in that moment, Mark knew that everything they had been through, all the challenges, the doubts, and the fears, had led them here to this moment of truth, to this undeniable connection. They had both taken risks, opened their hearts to each other, and in doing so, had found something far greater than they had ever expected. The future was still uncertain, and there were many challenges ahead, but for the first time, Mark and Eleanor didn't need to worry. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract, they were partners, truly and completely, in every sense of the word. As the night stretched on, they stood together in the quiet of the evening, looking out at the city, ready to face whatever came next. Hand in hand, they knew they were no longer alone. Together, they would face the future, no matter what it held.